I can't breathe. The desperate plea of at least 70 people, most of them African Americans, choked by brutal U.S. police, and the chants of thousands of demonstrators protesting against police violence, brutality, racism, and murder. Now it seems that air has become scarce in the United States, especially for African Americans frequently arrested by law enforcement. Brian Williams could not breathe when he was arrested for having no light on his bicycle. Eric Garner could not breathe when he was put into a chokehold because of selling untaxed cigarettes, and George Floyd suffocated while police planted a knee in the back of his neck for nearly 10 minutes when they thought that he had spent a phony $20 bill, all the while crying, "I can't breathe."
Brutal brutes.
Hello everyone and welcome to We the People. I'm your host Daniel Arya, and in this episode we'll speak about police brutality, which has become synonymous with police action in the U.S. Every single year, more than 1,000 Americans die at the hands of police, and the numbers only seem to be rising. This week, we have two distinguished guests on our program. Gerald Horn, who is a professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Life Malcolm, who is a community organizer. Please stay with us.
Statistics show that the trend of fatal police shootings in the U.S. seems to only be increasing, with a total of 716 civilians having been shot, 111 of whom were black, as of October 2021. In 2020, there were 1,021 fatal police shootings, and in 2019, there were 999. Additionally, the rate of fatal police shootings among Black Americans was much higher than that for any other ethnicity, standing at 37 fatal shootings per million of the population as of October 2021.
And now, based on research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, police violence is a leading cause of death for young men in the U.S. Over a life course, about 1 in every 1,000 black men can expect to be killed by police. Professor Horn explains the state of police brutality in America a year after the murder of George Floyd.
You may recall that after the killing of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department in the late spring of 2020, there were massive demonstrations, not only in the United States, but around the world, because of the police terror inflicted upon Black people. By some measures, these represented the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States of America. And as a result, we expected serious change to ensue. But that change has not come as of yet. In fact, there has been a backlash against change. You may have seen the results of the elections that took place in the United States on the first Tuesday of November of 2021. And you may also have noticed that many politicians were elected who are opposed to any change in police practices. This suggests that going forward, the road will be rocky indeed.
Black men are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than are white men. Black people who are fatally shot by police seem to be twice as likely as white people to be unarmed. Latino, American Indian, and Alaskan Native men and women are also significantly more likely to be killed by police than their white counterparts. Mr. Malcolm tells us if anything has improved more than a year after George Floyd's death.
No, nothing has improved regarding police brutality in the U.S. since George Floyd. It's likely worsened, if there is such a thing. It's always been extreme violence and extreme terror at the hands of police when it comes to African people and other colonized people in the U.S. The George Floyd murder happened to be one of the most brutal instances of police violence captured on video, maybe since the Rodney King beating in the early 1990s in this country. And so everybody had an opportunity to, when I say everybody, I mean people all around the world had the opportunity to witness the extreme violence and police terror that police heap upon the heads of ordinary Africans in this country every day.
Information from more than 2 million 911 calls in 2 U.S. cities reveals that white officers dispatched to black neighborhoods fired their guns 5 times more than black officers dispatched for similar calls to the same neighborhood. So what is the role of race when it comes to police violence?
In the United States, overwhelmingly and disproportionately, the victims of police terror happen to be Black. Many of us see this as the legacy of slavery. You know that in the United States and North America, there has been enslavement of African people longer than there has been freedom for African people. Enslavement of African people for 300 years or more, freedom, quote unquote, for a period since 1865.
In many states, a Bill of Rights for law enforcement officers shields personnel from investigation into misconduct. Even officers who are fired for misconduct are frequently rehired. The New York Times reported in 2015 that the police officer in Cleveland, Ohio, who fatally shot 12-year-old Tamir Rice in 2014, had previously resigned from another police department after it had deemed him unfit to serve. The Cleveland police did not review the officer's personnel file before hiring him.
Intelligent people who are colonized don't fight and struggle against racism. We all who are colonized in this world by white people, the role that racism plays in police brutality is to distract colonized people from the real struggle, which is that against colonialism, the fight for power, the fight for land, the fight for territory, the fight for freedom.
After many incidents in which police used brute force against unarmed African Americans, it seemed that people were fed up once they watched exactly how police officer Derek Chauvin planted a knee in the back of the neck of George Floyd for over 9.5 minutes and killed him, all the while he pleaded that he cannot breathe. The question one might ask is that are American police more violent in general?
I think that the figures show that the United States is one of the most violent nations on planet Earth. I see this as a legacy of how the nation was created. It was created by a violent seizure of the land from the indigenous population, a liquidation of a good deal of the indigenous population, and then kidnapping Africans with violence and bringing them to these shores to work for free for hundreds of years. That led to slave revolts that were repressed with bloodshed. And this is the culture that has been bequeathed to us today.
Thousands started protests and riots across America and later all around the world against police violence. The protesters demanded the defunding of the police, prosecution of the officers involved, and a dramatic change in law enforcement procedure, law, police recruitment, and to dismantle the systems of mass criminalization and incarceration. In light of these protests, what has the U.S. government done to decrease police violence?
The only thing that the American government, the United States government, has done for police brutality is give the brutal police more money, almost in every city and every state in this country. Each year, the police budget increases. The numbers, the head count on the police force increases. And of course, the brutality of the police increase. So if the United States government has done anything and that affects police brutality, it's give them more money for more guns and more terroristic tactics.
This is while, according to a report published in 2020, police budgets continue to be consistent across diverse geographies and cities in America, with up to 20 to 45% of discretionary funds allocated to the violence system.
After Reconstruction, the slave patrols morphed into local police departments, determined to enforce Jim Crow laws to control black people. Police unions really began consolidating power in the 1950s, in response to activists pushing for police reform. Fighting against oversight and advocating fiercely for their own ranks, they developed strict rules that remain in place for most police forces today. Police power continued to expand after the 1960s civil rights movement. The 1965 Law Enforcement Assistance Act, part of President Johnson's administration's war on crime, paved the way for militarization and funding by increasing federal involvement in local policing through grants. The support for local law enforcement from the federal government continued to grow, with a series of laws passed under subsequent presidents, from Reagan to Trump, that further aligned police departments with the military and perpetuated funding.
The Center for Popular Democracy Action released newly updated data from their 2017 Freedom to Thrive report. The updated data exemplified much of what is already known to be true. The police continue to receive an astronomical percentage of discretionary funds compared to resources that actually keep communities safe. All of the police budgets analyzed in the report have increased since 2017.
Certainly under Mr. Trump, the police were out of control. The U.S. Justice Department, which has central authority over the so-called criminal justice system, basically went asleep under Mr. Trump between 2016 and his defeat in 2020.
Also, police reform movements largely failed on ballots across the nation, but one Black Lives Matter activist running on a defund the police platform won a seat and became the youngest member of the Des Moines, Iowa City Council.
The Black Lives Matter movement has given so-called officials an out, an escape. It allows these so-called officials to appear to be friends of African and other colonized people in the U.S. by adopting this pop slogan, But the reality is, Joseph Robinette Biden, who is the same white man who put 100,000 or so police on the street that do the brutality to African people you and I are discussing right now all the time. That same Joseph Robinette Biden, who is the puppet master of the police, can say Black Lives Matter. Even some police will say Black Lives Matter, and at the same time shoot Black lives down.
In Minneapolis, where Floyd was killed by a police officer last year, voters rejected a citywide ballot measure, also known as Question 2, to overhaul the city's police department by replacing it with a new agency that would take a public health approach to law enforcement. 5 council members who backed the initiative were ousted from their seat. And in Seattle, a city that saw extended protests in the wake of Floyd's death, Republican Ann Davison won over the former public defender and police and jail abolitionist Nicole Thomas Kennedy to become the new Seattle City Attorney. So what can be done to stop the violence, discrimination, and abuse?
We have to be courageous enough to fight back. There's no other way. Malcolm X said it best. When the white man has his flag, we have our flag. When the white man has his army, we have our army. When the white man has his gun, we have our gun. And we just have to be intelligent, organize, create, and build dual and contending power. And last, but certainly not least, most of all, make a revolution. And that means overturn this nasty, stinking, foul social system, colonial capitalism, and bring into existence a socialist world under the leadership of the African working class.
The recent city elections illustrate the racist views held by many in law enforcement runs deeper than the police departments and prisons. Racism is a disease that many citizens of the United States possess and therefore do not vote for public officials who intend to reform police departments, and decries the systematic racism and brutality in these areas. And now let's check in with Abbas Montarem to see what he has for us.
Peace and welcome back to Power to the People. On our last segment of Power to the People, we discussed how the United States is a settler colonial regime. Just to give you all a quick refresher, settler colonialism is when a non-native people, in the case of America, Europeans, came to the indigenous people's lands and set up political, economic, military, and social rule. They established a permanent population, and at the same time they was doing that, they displaced the indigenous people, right? Then at the same time they was doing that, they was enslaving us, African peoples, right? We must fundamentally understand that settler colonialism is genocidal. It is, point blank period, it is genocidal. On October 22nd, a group called the In Spirit of the Mandela Coalition found the United States guilty of genocide. As African peoples, as indigenous peoples, as brown people, we have understand through ancestral knowledge, through the knowledge passed down through our elders, through being students of the Black radical tradition, that our experience on this land called America is genocidal, right? And this tribunal successfully charged the United States guilty with genocide, right? So to begin to understanding genocide, we have to understand the United Nations definition of genocide, right? United Nations, in the present convention, genocide may be any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, amongst national lines, ethnic lines, racial lines, religious groups, right? And some of these components of genocide are 1, killing members of a group, 2, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring apart its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent the births of a group. And 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. International jurists throughout the world came to Harlem, right? Came to the historic Autobahn in which El Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, was martyred, and picked up that torch in which Malcolm was calling for the international community to be aware of the human rights condition here in America, right? The jurists picked up the torch, right? The In Spirit of the Mandela Coalition picked up the torch and successfully charged genocide against the United States of America, right? They charged genocide amongst 5 specific charges. 1, the racist police killings of Black, brown, and indigenous people. 2, the hyper-incarceration of Black, brown, and indigenous people. 3, the political incarceration of civil rights, national liberation era revolutionaries, as well as current day activists. 4, the environmental racism and the impact on Black, brown, and indigenous communities, right? 5, public health racism. All of these charges together call for genocide. And that's what it is genocide. And the US was found guilty of genocide, right? If we understand our history, we know that African people have been murdered on this land, right? Through the transatlantic slave trade, it's estimated between 70 to 100 million of our people were murdered. And through slavery, were murdered, right? And it didn't end there. Through Jim Crow, there was lynchings, murders, right? We understand that the pigs, the police, right, kill us every day, right? The pigs kill us, the pigs incarcerate us, right? We have vigilantes like George Zimmerman murdering our children like Trayvon Martin, right? Emmett Till was beat up, killed, murdered by a white supremacist. This is what is genocide, right? The killing of our groups, the killing of the members of our groups, the killing of our new African nation, the killing of our Black nation, right? That is genocidal, right? We know that new African youth have been forced into foster care through this racist system of foster care, right? Taking our children from our people, from our house, and taking them otherwhere, right? We know that this has happened and has continued to happen, right? We know that Black, brown, and indigenous women have been forcibly sterilized by this racist government, right? And through that, it affects the population from growing, right? We know that today, more Black men are under correctional control than were enslaved. We went from the slave plantation all the way to the prison plantation, right? These are genocidal acts that have been committed, and the jurists, right, after hearing hours and hours and hours of testimony over 2 days, found the US guilty of genocide, right? So what does that mean now? Yes, this will be submitted to the United Nations. Yes, lawsuits will be filed, right? But we do not believe that the United Nations in itself will deploy troops because we know that the UN has oftentimes been a proxy for American violence. It has not done anything to sanction the United States on the violence that it has committed, not only to Black, brown, and indigenous people on this land, but to Black, brown, and indigenous people throughout the world, right? So it's important that we document this history. We document this genocide. We must say we will never forget the African Holocaust that has occurred, right? The African genocide that has and continues to occur on this land, right? And we must, as people who are struggling against imperialism, colonialism, we must call our position in this land as genocide. Because once we realize that is genocide, right, and once we understand that the US is guilty of genocide, it puts the US up there with the Adolf Hitlers of the world. And if we study Adolf Hitler, we know that Adolf Hitler learned about genocide from the United States of America, right? And it is our human right. We must understand that it is our human right to stop genocide against our people. The United Nations says that. The United Nations doesn't quote unquote permit genocide, right? But genocide has been found, and now it is our human right to stop that genocide. So we must embody, as what Jalil Muntaqim says, we are our own liberators. We are our own liberators, and we must stop the genocide against Black, brown, and indigenous people. We must stop the genocide that the US government commits every single day when it drops bombs in the Middle East, when it tries to steal the oil from Iran. That is genocidal. These sanctions is genocidal, right? So as people who are facing genocide, as African people facing genocide, it is our human right to stop this genocide. It is our human right to organize, to fight back, and to stop this genocide. We must embody the slogan, we are our own liberators. Power to the people.
Well, that was our show, everyone. Thank you for watching. I am your host, Daniel Arya, and do join us again next week on another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.